Bonjour et bienvenue à l'ILARA, l'Institut des langues rares de l'École pratique des hautes études PSL. Hello and welcome to ILARA, our institute whose aim is to showcase the rare and precious, ancient and contemporary languages of the world. Bernard Comrie's talk will be in English, but I'll introduce our institute in French first, as usual. L'ILARA est un institut créé en août 2020 par arrêté du ministère français de l'enseignement supérieur, de la recherche et de l'innovation. Sa mission est de sensibiliser et former le grand public aux langues rares, anciennes et contemporaines, et à leur culture. L'ILARA participe aussi à la valorisation et à la sauvegarde de ces langues à travers des actions de documentation. Deux offres principales sont actuellement disponibles pour tous les publics. D'une part, une offre de cours d'initiation, de découverte et d'approfondissement en présentiel à Paris. Et étant donné la situation en visioconférence, vous y trouverez par exemple de l'arménien classique, du latin, du géorgien classique, du judéo-arabe ainsi que des langues turciques. Et d'autre part, une offre de vidéoconférence virtuelle, l'ILARA en ligne, disponible sur notre chaîne et dont la première série, les invitations de l'ILARA, met à l'honneur des spécialistes de renommée internationale sous forme d'entretiens ou de conférences. Dans le cadre de l'ILARA en ligne, nous avons accueilli il y a 3 semaines Scott Delancey qui nous a fait découvrir les subtilités des langues d'Asie. Il y a 2 semaines, c'était Nick Evans qui nous initiait aux complexités de la langue aborigène d'Alabon d'Australie. La semaine dernière, Félix Ameka nous présentait quelques joyaux linguistiques des langues d'Afrique de l'Ouest. Et cette semaine, nous revenons en Eurasie afin de suivre Bernard Comrie dans cette zone d'extrême diversité linguistique qu'est le Caucase. Actuellement Distinguished Professor de linguistique à l'Université de Californie à Santa Barbara, Bernard Comrie a été formé à l'Université de Cambridge où il a étudié les langues médiévales et modernes avant d'y enseigner. Il a ensuite travaillé à l'University of Southern California, puis a été durant de longues années directeur du département de linguistique de l'Institut Max Planck d'Anthropologie évolutionniste à Leipzig. Cet institut a consacré le rayonnement de la typologie, dont Bernard Comrie est une des grandes figures internationales. La typologie linguistique s'intéresse à la façon dont les langues diffèrent entre elles et à la façon dont elles se ressemblent, afin de mieux comprendre la faculté humaine de langage. Cette dimension comparative a conduit Bernard Comrie à s'intéresser à des langues très diverses, de la Nouvelle-Guinée aux îles Andaman, en passant par le Caucase, région qu'il étudie depuis longtemps. Cette haute chaîne de montagnes, à la limite entre l'Europe et l'Asie, est le lieu d'une importante diversité linguistique, tout à fait passionnante pour qui s'intéresse aux langues rares. Bernard Comrie va développer pour nous ce soir quelques aspects particulièrement fascinants de ces langues. N'hésitez pas à lui poser vos questions, en français ou en anglais, à travers le chat en direct. Welcome to you all, and please ask your questions in the live chat, share your comments, and participate. We'll gather your questions and ask them to Bernard Comrie at the end of his presentation. Bernard, we're very grateful to you for accepting ILARA's invitation to present the languages of the Caucasus to the general public, underlying their fascinating features and their unique contribution to our linguistic knowledge. We're delighted to have you here with us today.
Thank you for that introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, today I am indeed going to take you on a linguistic journey to the Caucasus. This map gives you a rough idea of where the Caucasus lie between the Black Sea to the west and the Caspian Sea to the east. It is indeed a very mountainous area. The main chain of the Caucasus Mountains here is usually taken as the geographic division between Europe and Asia in this part of the world. Although in terms of land area, this is a very small region, nonetheless, it is a region of considerable linguistic diversity. Indeed, in the Middle Ages, the Arab geographers, who were among the first people to report about this area, they described this area as the mountain of tongues, or the mountain of languages. Some of the languages spoken in the Caucasus belong to large language families that are also found elsewhere in the world. For instance, we find some Indo-European languages, like Armenian, which forms a separate branch of the Indo-European language family, or Ossetic, a member of the Iranian sub-branch of the Indo-Iranian branch of Indo-European. There are also Turkic languages spoken in the Caucasus, such as Azerbaijani in Azerbaijan and Kumyk on the shore of the Caspian Sea. But I'm going to be particularly interested today in three indigenous families of the Caucasus, because the diversity of the Caucasus is not only in terms of number of languages, but also in the terms of the number of distinct language families that are represented in the area. The three indigenous families have gone by a number of names in their history. One I will call Kartvelian. It has also been called South Caucasian, and these terms like South Caucasian are indicative of the relative geographic location within the Caucasus. So the Kartvelian or South Caucasian family, which consists of one large language, Georgian, and a handful of smaller languages. Moving north and slightly to the west, the next family that I'll be mentioning is Abkhaz-Adyghe, also known as West Caucasian, sometimes as Northwest Caucasian. One of the languages in this family, and the one that I will be spotlighting later on, is Kabardian, spoken both in the Caucasus and by a diaspora population in Turkey. The third of the groups, now moving to the east, Nakh-Daghestanian, also known as East Caucasian or Northeast Caucasian, some languages that you might have heard of because of the importance of their speakers in recent geopolitical events are Chechen and Avar, though I will actually be concentrating on a group of smaller languages, the Tsezik subgroup of Nakh-Daghestanian, and in particular on one language, Kharshi, which is spoken in the west of the Republic of Dagestan within the Russian Federation. Now, these three families are very different from one another. Within some of the families, especially Nakh-Daghestanian, languages can be very different from one another. It may turn out eventually that some of the families are related to one another, but this is still very much an open question. The way in which I'm going to present material is, first of all, I'm going to look at some phenomena that are found at least widespread across the area, so including all three families, sometimes even extending into Indo-European or Turkic or Semitic languages in the same general area. Then, for each of the three families, I'm going to look at one particular topic and show how that provides us with a phenomenon of interest in terms of typological comparison with other languages of the world. So first of all, some of the phenomena that are widespread. One is the presence of ejective consonants. So most sounds in most languages of the world are made with lung air. So air starts from the lungs, comes out through the mouth. Ejective consonants do not use lung air. You trap air between your larynx, between your glottis, and wherever you're making the sound, bilabial with the lips, dental using the tongue and the hard palate. And you then raise your larynx. That increases the air pressure. When you release the labial or the dental closure, you then get a popping sound. So they sound similar to ordinary plosives, ordinary stops, but slightly different. I'll give you a couple of examples from Kharshi. With each of the languages, I have indicated on the slide the source of my information. So in Kharshi, we have a contrast between two words, actually both nouns. One means name, one means fire. Each of them begins with an affricate, a ts sound. But in the case of name, that's an ordinary, if you like, from an outside perspective, an ordinary ts made with lung air, tso. By contrast, the word for fire involves closing the glottis and using the air that is trapped inside the oral cavity. T'o, t'o, t'o. So you hear both a different timbre to the sound itself. And of course, you will also hear when I release the closure of my glottis, when I release the closure of the vocal cords in order to go into the vowel. So you'll notice in many of the examples, there will be glottal consonants indicated in the usual transliteration of Caucasian languages, also indicated in the International Phonetic Association, the IPA alphabet, by means of an apostrophe. So that was a phenomenon from phonology. Now a phenomenon from grammar. This is going to be a little bit more complex, but I will need to refer back to it in the body of the talk. So I would ask you maybe to concentrate especially on this part. Because one characteristic of the morphosyntax of many of the indigenous languages of the Caucasus is that they have so-called ergative alignment, or something similar to ergative alignment. And I'm going to introduce ergative alignment by contrasting it with the system that is more familiar to speakers of European and many non-European languages, namely nominative-accusative alignment. I've taken the example from Latin because Latin shows things very clearly thanks to its rather rich morphological system. So in Latin, nouns have two cases, two forms that are relevant, the nominative and the accusative. The nominative is used for subjects of intransitive verbs. So if I have an intransitive verb like to run, then its subject will be in the nominative. If I have a transitive verb like to praise, then its subject will be in the nominative. The mother praises the sons, mother in the nominative. The object will be in the accusative. So mother here is in the nominative case, sons is in the accusative case. And this pattern, where you have the same form for intransitive subjects and transitive subjects, but a different form for direct objects, is called nominative-accusative alignment. In many languages of the Caucasus, and I will illustrate this here using Kharshi, so one of the Cesic languages within the Nakh-Daghestanian family, Kharshi has a different system. There are two cases which are conventionally called the absolutive and the ergative. The subject of an intransitive clause, like the people have been working, that will be in the absolutive. The absolutive case is also used in the transitive clause, but not for the subject, rather for the direct object. So in this sentence, so Madinat bought the hen, the word for hen is in the absolutive case. And the proper name Madinat, so a girl's name or a woman's name, goes into the ergative case. So we have one case, the absolutive, used for intransitive subjects and for direct objects, and a different case that is used for transitive subjects. And this alignment is conventionally called ergative absolutive alignment. Although I illustrated the difference between nominative accusative and ergative absolutive alignment using the case systems of noun phrases, it can also show in other parts of the grammar. So in Latin, for instance, an intransitive verb will agree in person number with its intransitive subject. A transitive verb agrees with its transitive subject, not with its direct object. So the mother praises the sons, the verb will be singular, agreeing with the mother, not the sons. By contrast, in Kharshi, an intransitive verb will agree with its subject, so human plural here, but a transitive verb will agree with its object. The word Madina, feminine proper name belongs to gender 2. You might think of that as being the feminine gender. The word for hen belongs to gender 3. You might think of that as being the animal gender. And the verb here agrees with the hen, agrees with the direct object, not with the subject. There's one other general point about most of the languages, indigenous languages of the 3 families of the Caucasus that I'd like to mention, since it will show up in the examples. That is, they have so-called free word order. Now, what does that mean? In a sense, it means that if I have sentences like these 2, in principle, I can take the words and rearrange them. I can put them in any order, and the result will be a grammatical sentence of the language with more or less the same meaning. I cannot do that in English. John saw Mary is very different from Mary saw John in English. In English, you rely on the word order in transitive clauses to tell which noun phrase is subject, which one is object. In most languages of the Caucasus, which have rich case systems, you do not need to rely on word order in that way. The case marking will tell you what is subject and what is object. What that means is that word order is freed up for other purposes, so-called pragmatic purposes. So I can use the word order, differences in word order, to communicate differences in emphasis. For instance, what is the essential new information that I am introducing in the sentence? Or maybe I can put a noun phrase at the beginning of the sentence to link it to things that have been mentioned in the preceding discourse. Okay, so those were some general properties of languages of these 3 families. Although the 3 families are not related or cannot be proven to be related, nonetheless, they do share some of these properties. Some of these properties extend even to Indo-European and Turkic and Semitic languages spoken in the area. So they have probably spread by diffusion, spread by language contact, rather than necessarily having been inherited from some single ancestor language. Now I'm going to turn to the individual language families, so the 3 of them. For each one, I have picked a particular construction that strikes me as being interesting. Interesting from the perspective of linguistic typology, so from the perspective of cross-linguistic comparison. Interesting usually because the construction differs in significant ways from what we are more accustomed to in European languages, many of the other better described, better known languages of the world. For the Nakh-Daghestanian language family, where I will be spotlighting the Kharshi language, I'm going to be looking at reciprocal constructions. So reciprocal constructions, well, in English, in their English translations, they will usually have a so-called reciprocal pronoun, so a form like each other. That's probably the most frequent form in English. So in English, I can have an example like the dogs bit each other. 3 constituents, the dogs as subject, bit, the verb or the predicate, each other, then the object. Now, notice there are actually a number of other things I can say about those noun phrases. I said the dogs is subject. I could also say it's agent in semantic terms. And I could say the each other here is functioning as patient in semantic terms. So subject and agent coincide, object and patient coinciding. In addition, since I'm looking at a construction that expresses some kind of co-reference, the each other refers back to the dogs. Given that there is this co-reference, I can also distinguish the 2 noun phrases involved as an antecedent, that's the full noun phrase, that's an ordinary noun phrase, like the dogs, and an anaphor, each other. So each other, if I simply say each other in isolation, would be a very odd thing to do, but if I did it, you'd sort of have no idea what I'm referring to. But once I put it in a sentence, it gets a specific interpretation because it has an antecedent, a full noun phrase, which tells you, gives you the referent, and then you know that the anaphor has the same referent. Since it's a reciprocal anaphor, you get a slightly more complicated interpretation. This is somewhat different from the dogs bit themselves, with each dog biting that same dog. The dogs bit each other is a more complex scenario where, at least in the ideal case, one dog bites all the others and each of those other dogs bites each of the others. So it's actually semantically quite complex. Fortunately, languages have rather simple ways of expressing that. I should point out that cross-linguistically, there are many ways of expressing reciprocals that do not involve two-noun phrases. So many languages will have a special reciprocal prefix on the verb, for instance, which will make the verb intransitive. But we're going to be concentrating on languages that have two-noun phrases, a subject and an object, an agent and a patient, an antecedent and an anaphor. Notice that in English, the antecedent can appear as subject, the anaphor can appear as object, the inverse is not possible. So in English, I cannot say each other bit the dogs. In fact, if I were to say that in English under normal circumstances, so not in a linguistic lecture is not normal circumstances. If I were to go to the bar, the pub, I cannot, of course, do that these days, but in better times, I might go and I would go in and someone would say hello to me and I would say, you know what, each other bit the dogs. They would look at me very strangely, wonder perhaps if I'd had a few drinks already before showing up. So in English, it's so obvious that that is impossible that native speakers don't usually even think about it. They wouldn't even think of saying that. They would be puzzled and probably even have difficulty interpreting what is intended. So English has what I'm going to call the canonical construction, where the antecedent is the full noun phrase and is also the subject or agent of the clause. The each other, the reciprocal pronoun, is of course an anaphor by definition, but is also patient or object. The non-canonical construction, impossible in English, would have things the other way round. So each other as agent or subject, and the dogs, the antecedent, as patient or object. Let's now look at what happens in some of the languages of the Cesic subgroup within the Nakh-Daghestanian language family. And I'm going to start off with examples from Farsi. There will be a brief comparative note later on. Suppose we want to say the dogs bit each other in Farsi. In Farsi, we have two possibilities. I can use a canonical construction. So I can say literally, the dogs bit each other. The dogs will be subject. Remember, ergative absolutive alignment, so the dogs will be in the ergative case. The pronoun each other, as patient, as direct object of the clause, will be in the absolutive case. So despite the difference in alignment, the difference in case marking, the basic syntax of the clause is essentially similar to what we find in English. The antecedent as subject, the anaphor as object. However, in Farsi, you can also do things the other way round. You can also use the non-canonical construction. So in addition to saying literally the dogs bit each other, I can also say literally each other bit the dogs. Each other in the ergative case as subject of a transitive clause, dogs in the absolutive as patient or direct object of a transitive clause. Now you might say, well, okay, you can say that second possibility. Maybe that has something to do with the fact that the language has ergative absolutive alignment. Maybe since transitive clauses are constructed somewhat differently. Maybe that allows, maybe that licenses this otherwise unusual construction. Well, people have investigated reciprocal constructions across a large number of languages, reciprocal constructions that involve a reciprocal pronoun, so two noun phrases, one in subject position, one in object position, including languages that have ergative absolutive alignment in their case marking, in their verb agreement. We've also investigated languages which have different word orders, maybe the object preceding the subject. But across most of those languages, despite the radical differences in syntactic organization, the reciprocal construction is nearly always the canonical construction, and the canonical construction is nearly always the only possibility. In fact, the Czech languages are the only languages I know of where this is clearly not the case, where both canonical and non-canonical constructions exist and exist as frequent, bona fide constructions in the language in question. There is, in fact, some variation across the Czech languages. They're not all absolutely identical. So I simply mention here two other languages from this group. These are closely related languages. I mean, impressionistically, maybe as closely related as the Germanic languages are to one another. So not immediately mutually intelligible, certainly not, but you would immediately recognize similarities across the languages. So Huarshi, as we saw for reciprocal constructions, allows both the canonical and the non-canonical constructions. Hinok, another language in the family, allows only the canonical construction. In this respect, it's like English. Bejta, another language in the family, allows only the non-canonical construction. In Bejta, you cannot say the dogs bit each other. You can only say each other bit the dogs. So what I hope to have shown with that example is how detailed study of a language with a small number of speakers, a group of languages with relatively few speakers, rather remote part of the world, can nonetheless throw light on possibilities for cross-linguistic variation, show us that logical possibilities are indeed attested, even if they are extremely rare across the languages of the world. I want now to turn to the second family, indigenous family that we're going to look at, Abkhaz-Adyghe, also known as Western Caucasian or Northwest Caucasian, if you want to keep in mind the relative geographic locations of these languages. And the construction that we're going to be looking at here is relative clauses. My starting point is going to be relative clauses in European languages, especially in the more literary variant of European languages. I'm actually going to start off with an example from English. And as I was thinking which example should I use, I sort of was thinking to myself, where can I go to find a solid, attested example of good literary modern English? And a little voice whispered to me, Virginia Woolf. I looked on the net, and the very first hit I got was indeed the ideal relative clause for illustrating my point in modern standard literary English. So Virginia Woolf in The Waves says, I addressed myself as one would speak to a companion with whom one is voyaging to the North Pole. Okay, that with whom, that's a very literary construction. The whole sentence is quite literally. In more normal spoken English, one might say something like, a companion that I'm going to the North Pole with, or a companion that's going to the North Pole with me, to make it even easier. Fortunately, Virginia Woolf was not tempted in that direction. Now, this kind of construction, as I've said, is widespread in more literary versions of European languages, often less so in colloquial versions, though just very often also filtered down into colloquial versions, at least to some extent. What are its unusual properties? Well, one way of looking at this is by no means a formal analysis, but it gives us some indication of how one might go about describing this kind of construction to someone who is not familiar with it. So the construction has a head noun, a companion, and I then want to provide you with some further information about this companion, which will allow you to identify the companion that I'm talking about. And one way in which I can do that is by giving you a sentence which describes the companion in question. So one is voyaging to the North Pole with the companion. That's the companion I mean. One is voyaging to the North Pole with this companion. And in a normal English simple sentence, so a main clause, I would simply say one is voyaging to the North Pole with the companion. With the companion, in most neutral word order, would be at the end of that sentence. In order to make a relative clause out of that, a literary relative clause out of that, I have to do two things. First of all, I have to replace the companion with a relative pronoun. So with the companion will become with whom. But then I have to do one other thing, and this is really the critical criterion, the critical feature of this construction. I have to, in some sense, move this noun phrase or this prepositional phrase to the beginning of the relative clause. So in English, I cannot say a companion, one is voyaging to the North Pole with whom. I have to say a companion with whom one is voyaging to the North Pole. So the with whom is now at the beginning of the relative clause, and there is, if you like, a gap or a nothing at the end where I would normally expect the with prepositional phrase to occur. So that's actually quite a complicated construction. Maybe its most complicated part being the requirement that the relative pronoun occurs not in its normal position within a clause. The normal word order of the language would say it should occur at the end. Rather, it must appear wherever it would otherwise have appeared, it must appear at the beginning. So you have, certainly at least in a metaphorical sense, you have a so-called grammatical movement or syntactic movement. I don't mean literally, people are going around moving noun phrases, but if you compare the relative clause with the corresponding main clause, then one crucial difference, maybe the single most important difference in standard literary English, is the different position of the relative pronoun. And this is something which is known to give difficulty to speakers of other languages who are learning literary English or French, German, Russian, whatever it might be, European languages that have this construction. If they do not have the construction in their own language, it is one of the more difficult constructions to acquire. Now, as I've mentioned, in non-standard English, there are other ways of expressing that idea. And for typological purposes, I'll maybe mention a couple of the other possibilities found in non-standard English before we come finally to Kabardian. The examples are taken from real conversation. I've actually taken them from an article by Jim Miller on Scottish English, though I should mention, although the examples are from Scottish English, there is nothing specifically Scottish about them in terms of this particular syntactic phenomenon. They're things that could easily be found in colloquial English from other parts of the world. So one construction that Miller found in his corpus was a construction like this one. I haven't been to a party yet that I haven't got home the same night. Okay, so the head noun is a party. What kind of party is it? Well, it's the kind of party such that, as a logician or a philosopher might say, such that I have not got home the same night. Notice in the relative clause, if we want to call it such, that I haven't got home the same night, there's no reference back to the party. So you simply have to work out by inference that the semantic relation between the party and my getting home is something like getting home from the party. So in standard literary English, I might say something like a party from which I haven't got home the same night. This kind of construction, incidentally, is widespread across the languages of the world. It's the way Japanese, for instance, constructs relative clauses, a different word order in Japanese, but the basic phenomenon that in the relative clause, you do not refer to the head noun. That is true for Japanese and many other languages. Another way in which colloquial English constructs relative clauses is like this example, also from Miller. The girl that her 18th birthday was on that day. In more literary English, the girl whose 18th birthday was on that day. Notice my pronunciation of whose. It doesn't really come all that naturally to me in spoken English. Okay, the girl that her 18th birthday was on that day. Colloquial English, in colloquial English, you can put a pronoun, here the possessive pronoun her, in the relative clause, referring back to the head noun. This pronoun, sometimes called in traditional grammar a resumptive pronoun, the overall construction sometimes called pronoun retention. This is found, for instance, in Persian, so in standard Persian. The translation equivalent of this English sentence would likewise use a pronoun. Okay, so English has a complicated construction. Standard literary English has a complicated construction. Next question. Could there be languages that have an even more complicated construction? So could there be languages that have thought of complexities, linguistic complexities, that even Virginia Woolf had not dreamt of? And I think the answer is yes. And Kabardian, Northwest Caucasian language, provides an instance of just such a language. So my source here, the main source, is Colaruso's Grammar of Kabardian. I'm also grateful for consultation with Ayla Bozkurt-Appelbaum, who is a native speaker of Kabardian from Turkey and a graduate of UCSB's doctoral program. Okay, what's the basic way of constructing simple clauses in Kabardian? Well, one answer is Kabardian doesn't have simple clauses. Nothing is simple in Kabardian, but okay. We have simple sentences, main clauses. If I want to say something like, I am writing, or I see you, or I gave you to him, then it's possible to put in pronouns, though not usual to do so. It's much more usual to express those arguments of the verb by means of prefixes on the verb. Occasionally suffixes will also be relevant, though it's mainly by means of prefixes. And those prefixes operate on an ergative absolutive basis. So I am writing, I will have the absolutive first person singular prefix, s, in initial position. I see you, I is now ergative. It's the same form, s, but it now has to go into a different position. It has to go into the, there are many positions, but of the relevant positions, it's now going into the second one. The first position here is reserved for the object in the absolutive. So w here, I see you. So the absolutive prefix will come first in the chain of pronominal prefixes. The ergative will be later. If I have three, so I gave you to him, then they will come in the order absolutive, oblique, ergative, and there might be other prefixes involved as well. So here, I gave you to him, I as subject of this transitive, in fact, ditransitive construction in the ergative, the last in the chain. I gave you, the direct object, absolutive, first position in the chain. And to him will be the oblique, or the dative form of the pronoun, which occurs between the absolutive and the ergative. This is already fairly complicated, but there are many other languages of the world where it's also normal to express pronominal arguments of a verb by means of the verb morphology. What is unusual about Kabardyan and other Abkhaz-Adyghe languages is that they also do this with the translation equivalents of relative pronouns. In English, we had the problem that a relative pronoun has to be, at least metaphorically, moved to the beginning of the clause. In Kabardyan, yes, you have to move a relative pronoun, you have to do something with it, but what you do with it is you tuck it into, you insert it into the morphology of the verb. So the morphology of the verb, now in a relative clause, will also include morphemes that are relative markers. They indicate that this is a relative clause, and they will also indicate whether you're relativizing an absolutive noun phrase or an ergative noun phrase or some other kind of noun phrase. So the man who went, the relative clause normally precedes the head noun. So the man who went, here I'm relativizing the subject of an intransitive clause, so I will use the absolutive relative marker, which happens to be optional. The man whom the woman saw, I'm now relativizing the object of the transitive verb see, so again I will use the absolutive form of the relative marker. Again, it's optional. The man who ate meat, now I'm relativizing the subject of a transitive verb. I have to use the ergative form, and the ergative form, this now has to be overt, so the marker will have to go into the ergative slot in the morphology, and the relevant form is z, the single consonant z. Absolutive here is a 0 prefix. So the man who ate meat, the relative marker, if you like, the translation equivalent of the relative pronoun, is a single consonant. You have to listen carefully to hear it. It's a single consonant. What it tells you, given its segmental composition, the z, and its position in the morphological pattern, what it tells you is I'm a relative pronoun and I'm relativizing the ergative constituent, the subject of a transitive verb. The man to whom I gave a book, so English moves to whom to the beginning of the relative clause. In Kabardyan, essentially, what you have to do is you have to take the relative pronoun to whom and stick it into the appropriate slot in the verb morphology between the absolutive prefix and the ergative prefix. So here you have the z, again marking relative, but you have a postposition-like element or preposition, but after the item it governs, which marks dative case, which marks a dative semantic relation. I suppose the next stage is I should ask someone to translate Virginia Woolf's The Waves into Kabardyan and see how that comes out. And then I would have some really nice comparative examples to work with. But before that I think is not a project that is going to be realized within the next few minutes, certainly probably not within the next few years. I would like to go to the third of our language families, the Kartvelian language family. And here I'm going to take examples from Georgian, by far the most widely spoken language of this small family, maybe 4 languages. My source is basically George Hewitt's Grammar of Georgian, though I also, if there was a particular numeral that I wanted and that happens not to be included in his grammar, then I searched on the internet to make sure that I could find lots of genuine examples of the numeral in question. Now, with the other languages, I started off with English, or what we find in European languages, and then went to the unusual phenomenon in the language in question. Here, I'm going to operate in the opposite direction. We're going to start off with a Georgian form, and then I'm going to ask, what might this tell us about forms in other languages? And the initial observation, maybe not a very surprising observation at first sight, is that the Georgian word for 1,000, atasi, is literally 1,000. Okay, you might say, why is that surprising? Okay, Georgians are good at arithmetic, but so are lots of other people. Yeah, 1,000, that's 1,000. Why should I be particularly interested in that? Well, in order to show why that's actually an interesting way of constructing the numeral, let me tell you a few other things about Georgian numeral words, some of which we will need to refer back to later. So the word for two is ori. So you have a stem, or, and then very often you will find this nominative suffix e. You will find this occurring on many numerals. Georgian has complex alignment, incidentally, so the term nominative is a little bit misleading, but it is conventional. So ori is the word for two, its stem is or. Ati, as we've already seen, is the word for 10, or at is the stem, and then e, the suffix. If I want to form a teen, so a number like 12, for instance, then the construction in Georgian is I take the word for two, or, I put t in front of it and met after it. Notice the ejective consonant here. T in front and met after it. And I could gloss those synchronically as together forming teen. That's how you form teens in Georgian. And then I have the nominative suffix at the end. Etymologically, the structure is a little bit more transparent. That initial t is actually from the word at, meaning 10, and met, the met part, is a word meaning more. So it's at least historically 10, 2 more. The word for 20, as in many languages, is not decomposable into a bit that means 2 and a bit that means 10. It's simply aussi. We can look at some ways of forming some other numerals, some higher numerals. 100 is asi, so as is the root for 100. 200 is formed perfectly regularly. I have the word for 2, I have the word for 100, and then the nominative suffix, orasi. And as we've already seen, 1,000 is expressed as 1,000, atasi. The question I want to ask is, atasi clearly has an internal structure. Transparently, it consists of the morpheme for 10 and the morpheme for 100. How relevant is that for the way in which the word is used in the modern Georgian numeral system? And there are ways in which one can actually test that empirically. One very simple way is to ask questions like, well, how would you say 2,000? Do you say 2000? That would suggest that the 1,000 structure is really synchronically valid. Or do you say rather 2 1,000s? That would suggest 1,000 is a single unit, albeit with internal structure, so a single unit that means 1,000, and if you have 2 of them, then you must just put 2 at the beginning. Well, if we look at the usual way in modern Georgian, there are some counterexamples at least in older Georgian, but this is the structure in the modern language. The way in which you say 2,000 is you take this, at least historically, complex element, 1,000, and you put 2 in front of it, ori atasi, 2 1,000s. You do not say 2,000, so you do not say otsi asi. Somewhat similarly, if you wanted to say 1,200, you would say 1000 plus 200. Atas, which is 1,000, orasi, which is 200. You do not say 1200, or that is not the usual way of expressing 1200. So what this means is that in Georgian, although the numeral atasi has an internal structure, speakers essentially disregard that internal structure when they're creating larger numerals. 1,000 is, and it's probably still transparent to native speakers, 1,000 is 1000, but when I want to create larger numbers, I forget about that. I treat 1000 as being an indivisible unit that happens to mean 1,000. What I want to do now, having presented those Georgian data, is to look at a couple of other European languages where we also find somewhat unusual numeral constructions, and ask whether the insight we gained from Georgian might provide us with some useful insight into those other languages. The first other language that I want to look at is Polabian. Now, Polabian is a Slavic language, so ultimately an Indo-European language. It's extinct, or has been extinct for a couple of hundred years at least. It was spoken in the area around the river Elbe in what is now northern Germany. And there is some documentation of this language. The main documentation is basically kind of phrasebook documentation, so sentences in German and their corresponding translations into Polabian. But of course, as in any modern phrasebook, one of the things which is included in multiple sources is the numeral system. So we actually know quite a lot about the numeral system. I've taken the data from a standard Polabian English dictionary. I've used the normalized transcription that the compilers of the dictionary use. That transcription is not entirely uncontroversial, but it doesn't affect any of the points to be made. The people who compiled the original sources, of course, used impressionistic spellings, very often German-based. Some lower numerals, those of you who know a Slavic language will sense that there's nothing really unusual here. So the word for 4, citer, the word for 10, descent. Forming teens, 14, citernotsti, 4, and then a suffix which means teen. That suffix originally comes from a sequence meaning on 10. Whether that was transparent to speakers of Polabian, we don't know and cannot now tell. But at any rate, that's how you form the teens. The productive way of forming the tens is to use, again, a suffix disjont, related, obviously, to the word for 10. And I've glossed that as T. That's how you express 10 in these compound numerals by multiplication. So 40 is 4, citer, and then disjont, indicating that you have to multiply by the base 10. Question, how did you express 20 in Polabian? In nearly all modern, all attested Slavic languages, the word for 20 derives from 2 tens. So there's an element which means 2, and there's an element which, at least historically, means 10. Such a form is not attested for Polabian. Of course, we can't tell, maybe it existed as maybe a minority alternative, less frequent alternative. The only form that's attested in the documentation is descent notsti. Descent 10, notsti teen. Obvious, you count 17, you count 7, 8, 9, 10. If you count in the teens, 17, 18, 19, 10-teen. It's obvious that's what the form should be. And it's an idiosyncrasy of a genuine decimal system that in fact you express 20 by means of multiplication, 20. In English, the morphophonemics has been messed up a little bit, but there's still a tw bit that means 2 and a T bit that means 10. However, in Palabian, you say 10-teen. Next question, suppose you want to count higher. 17, 18, 19, 10-teen, 11-teen. That sounds sort of plausible in English if that's the way in which English did such higher numerals. However, Palabian, and of course we have limited attestation, but as far as we can tell, Palabian did not do that, even though Descent Notsti has a clear internal structure, 10-teen. You treat it as a single unit, meaning 20, and if you want to say 21, then you put the word for one, you add the word for one. Descent Notsti is 20, I now add 1 and I get 21. Both linear orders are attested, so Descent Notsti Yanu or Yanu Descent Notsti, but the word 10-teen, it had an internal structure, but that seems to have been disregarded by speakers when they counted higher than 20. 10-teen, despite its internal structure, is simply the word that means 20. And in a decimal system, as is true for nearly all Slavic languages, also for German, the other language the last speakers of Palabian would have known, you say 21 by combining 20 two tens with the word for one, whatever the internal structure of 20, even if it has no internal structure, as let's say in many Romance languages, French 20, for instance. I want to look at one other language. This is Danish. So Danish is unusual among the Scandinavian or Nordic or North Germanic languages in having a way of constructing numerals between in the range 21 to 99, 21 through 99, that is different even from its close neighbors, closely related languages like Norwegian and Swedish. I've given you here my source for the forms, so the grammar, and I also checked forms, not the forms, I did check the forms from the grammar, they're of course all correct, but where I wanted to check something as possible or impossible that was not given in the grammar, then I also checked with the excellent Danish dictionary that is available online. The phenomenon that we're interested in is the way in which numerals like 60 and 80, and as we will all see in a moment, 50, 70, and 90 are expressed in Danish. The Danish for 60 is tres. So you have an initial element that is clearly related to the word for 3, and then you have this s suffix, which presumably is an instruction to multiply by 20, sort of the only way you can get from 3 to 60. 80, you have an initial element that is clearly related to the word for 4, and then you have this suffix. How do you do 50, 70, and 90? Well, literally, remember, 60 is 3 and then maybe something that means times 20. What you do here is you say half of the third and then something that might mean 20. Half of the third 20. Well, the third 20 goes from 41 to 60. So half of the third 20 is going to be 50. Likewise, half of the fourth times 20 is going to be 3.5 or 3.5 times 20, namely 70. And 90 will be half of the fifth 20, or half of 5, half of 5, half of the fifth one times 20. So these elements clearly have some kind of internal structure. And in fact, if we go to older forms, the structure is more transparent. These forms are still listed in big modern dictionaries like the online dictionary I mentioned, though they're identified as being older forms. So 60 was originally something like 3 times 20. 50 was half of the third, namely 2.5, 2.5, 2,5, however you're used to thinking of that term. So 2.5 times 20, which gives you 50. This way of constructing fractions, 1.5, 2.5, 3.5, and so on, as half of the second, half of the third, half of the fourth, was at one time quite widespread in languages of the general Baltic area. So both Slavic languages and Baltic languages and Germanic languages. Often now there are only a couple of remnants. People don't interpret them synchronically in that way, but there are still some varieties where that construction is productive. We also see the transparent origin if we look at the ordinal numerals, and these are the current ordinals. So 60th is the 3 times 20th. 50th is half of the third times 20th, if I were to say that morphological structure in English. Now, on a number of occasions, I have pointed this out to speakers of Danish that I know, so usually linguists, people, so Danish speakers who might be actually interested in listening to me talking about this. And I sort of point out to them, you know, you have a vigesimal system, and you have a phenomenon that is known in the typology of numeral systems as overcounting. You look ahead to the next number. 2.5 is expressed as half of the third. And the usual reaction I get is, oh, I'd never thought of that. Usual reaction I get is that these forms like hal tres, or maybe I should go back to the original forms. These forms like tres, meaning 60, form meaning 80, the form meaning 50, the form meaning 70, the form meaning 90. We think of them just as being irregular forms. You know, we count in tens, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. It's just that the forms are morphologically irregular. You have to learn them. So a form like 55, which in Danish is literally 5 and half of the third times 20. Although I can analyze it maybe historically in that way, native speakers tell me that they simply think of it as being 5 and 50, and the word for 50 happens to be, if you like, strange, if you want to look at it from an outside perspective, but it's actually the perfectly normal Danish word for 50. It turns out that many of the speakers of Danish that I know also speak Russian. This shows you they are not a representative sample of Danish speakers. But very often they then point me to Russian and say, well, you know, in Russian, most of the tens are transparent. 20, 30, 50, 60, and so on. Most of them have transparent structures, 2 tens, 3 tens, 5 tens, 6 tens, but 40 is an exception. The word for 40 in Russian, unusual among the Slavic languages, most have a transparent structure, but for 40 in Russian, you have to say 40, and you just have to learn that. So likewise, we just learn those words in Danish. And they point out to me that there is one interesting difference between Danish and, let's say, a language that actually has vigesimal structure in at least part of its numeral system, like French, and that is that in Danish, you hear a form like this half of the third 20, and as soon as you hear that, you know that you are dealing with 50. You don't have to, you can simply treat it as an unanalyzable unit. By contrast, in French, if I hear a form like 75, there's really no point other than listening to the whole thing at which I know whether I'm dealing with 60-something or 70-something. I hear 60, I don't know. I hear 60, and I still don't know because it could be 64. I hear 75, I hear the nasal vowel. Well, okay, now I know that it's 70, but I already know that it's 75. That's the only possibility. So there's no point in this numeral It really is a sort of vigesimal numeral. There's no point internally to this numeral where I can say, oh, I know it's 70, but I have no idea what the unit is going to be. Let me summarize. Well, I can't really summarize. I've given you lots of detailed information. I've taken you on a journey to the Caucasus. I'm speaking to an audience largely in France, I assume largely French speaking. So if you want a different journey to the Caucasus, you could go to the book by Alexandre Dumas, Voyage au Caucase. It's very different. You will see there are illustrations in the book, pictures of mountains. Sorry, I haven't really shown you a picture of a mountain. Descriptions of local customs, the incredible hospitality of the local people. I have given you no idea of that. But what I have tried to do, and this is something which I suspect you will not find in Dumas, what I have tried to do is to show you that this area, the Caucasus, in addition to its beautiful scenery, in addition to the wonderful people who live there, is also a source of interesting, fascinating linguistic data that can both extend our horizons of what we consider to be possible or plausible or likely in the languages of the world, and can even throw some light back onto things we thought we knew about the languages that we speak as first or second languages, the languages that we already speak well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bernard, for this absolutely fascinating talk and very subtle examples. I'm sure everyone loved it in the audience. And we have a number of questions. And also, first of all, I'd like to welcome back to the chat people who have already been with us on ILARA, such as Hilary Chappell, Marianne Mithun, Tom Durand. So welcome back, and welcome also to all our other new participants. So we have some questions that I'm going to group according to your presentation, Bernard. Mm-hmm. So first of all, about reciprocals. The first question was by Isabelle Brib, who's also returning participant. Isabelle, hello. He says, let me find the question there. So, yes. Are those two constructions, so she's talking about the quasi-reciprocals, the canonical and non-canonical ones, are those two constructions also possible with reflexives?
Okay, a very good question. For a full answer, I would refer you to the paper that I cited, which is available online, so it's available open access. But the answer is yes. Similar issues arise with reflexive constructions. So if we had the dog bit itself, in English, you cannot say itself bit the dog. And again, across most of the languages of the world, you cannot do that. In some Cesic languages, that alternative, that non-canonical construction is possible. Rather interestingly, there are some languages where the rules are different for the reciprocal and the reflexive constructions, and wherever there is such a difference, the reciprocal construction is more likely to allow the non-canonical construction. So indeed, this the things that I said do apply to reflexive pronouns, but it is not the case that the same rule or the same set of rules applies literally to reflexives and reciprocals in a given language.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. If Isabelle, you have anything else to add, you can do that now, and we'll get back to your question. Then we have Timur Maisak, who's saying, first of all, hi and greeting from Moscow, and asking, dear Bernard, in the Quarshi example, each other bit the dogs, the reciprocal pronoun in the ergative was placed after the absolutive NP.
Mm-hmm.
To what extent the word order is relevant here? E.g., is it equally okay to have each other ergative dogs plural absolutive bit?
Mm-hmm. Okay, I see that I'm getting a wonderful series of questions. They're wonderful also because at least so far I can give some kind of answer. Indeed, the observation is a very important one. In those constructions, whether canonical or non-canonical in Cesic languages, with an antecedent and an anaphor, only the order where the antecedent precedes the anaphor is possible. This is, of course, also generally the case across most of the languages of the world, though in most of the languages of the world, this is also in part because usually subjects precede objects. And there are some languages where where that would be the normal word order, but where other orders with the antecedent, with the anaphor before the antecedent would also be possible. I mean, even in English, if you topicalize an object noun phrase, you can just about get such examples, certainly with reflexive pronouns. But in the Cesic languages, although word order is in general free, constituents can be arranged in any order depending on pragmatic factors, with antecedents and anaphors in reflexive and reciprocal constructions. That is not the case. As to exactly what the implications of that are, that's something that my co-authors and I have been thinking about. We have not really, I think, yet come to any clear decision. One possibility, so one avenue that we think might be worth exploring, we of course presented this as being essentially a syntactic phenomenon. Another way of approaching it might be to say that it is rather a morphological phenomenon, in which case antecedent and anaphor would have somewhat different interpretations than they would within the syntax. But as I say, so far, we have not come to any really clear decision. We don't see any really clear evidence which would lead us to move in one direction or the other with respect to the further analysis. So it's certainly quite correct that in terms of the analysis that I presented here, it is an idiosyncratic fact, if you like, a stipulation that the antecedent must precede the anaphor in these constructions.
Thank you very much for your answer. So here again, Timur, if you have anything to add, just feel free to do it in the chat. And meanwhile, I'm going to read the following comment right after, so also about reciprocals by Peter Arkadiev, who says, a comment on reciprocals. As far as I know, the non-canonical construction with the pronoun is also found in Circassian. See Alexander Letuchy's paper in Nedelkov's Reciprocal Constructions, 2007. And one could also argue that verbal reciprocals in Northwest Caucasian languages are only non-canonical. This is not the only possible analysis, however.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that last point is important. We do. I don't recall if in our paper we discuss West Caucasian. I think we do, and we point out that there seem to be competing analyses. There may even be some instances where the data are less clear. But I mean, in general, the point certainly goes through. But one of the questions that would need to be answered would be, since in West Caucasian languages, this is part of the verb morphology, one question that would need to be answered is whether this is actually detransitivizing verb morphology. Of course, if it is detransitivizing verb morphology, then in that construction, there is no transitive subject, there is no direct object. you simply have a single intransitive construction with an intransitive subject. So that's, I think, the main issue that would need to be resolved. I would just like to add, since many of the people asking questions are people that I know, I will just take the opportunity now to say hello to everybody I know, and thank you for tuning in.
Yes, we'll pass on all the comments in the chat to you, and I think everyone's very happy with your lecture and saying hello, and so I'm going to give all this to you at the end. For now, I have another remark by Peter Arkadiev, who says conspicuously, and that's about the relative clauses. So it's the second point. Conspicuously, all West Circassian and Kabardian varieties I'm familiar with, including the standard variety as described in grammars published in Russian, do not have the relative absolutive I. But then we have a remark by Mizan Konuk, who says that according to the data that I gathered in Antalya, Turkey, in an Abkhaz village, the relative absolutive ya can be found, but it is not obligatory. Sorry. So I don't know what you would have to say about this.
Okay. Yeah. I took the data from a secondary source. So I took the data from Colaruso's grammar of Kabardian, though, as I mentioned, I also checked it with my former doctoral student, Ayla, who is a native speaker of Kabardian from Turkey, so not from Kabardia. So this is these communities have been apart for, what, a century and a half, roughly. Different developments. The sources that I have say that the absolutive relative marker is optional, so it was in parentheses in my examples, in my glosses. It may well be that there are particular varieties, excuse me a minute. It may well be that there are particular varieties where it is impossible. And that might be the case for one or more of the languages in that group. All I can say is that the varieties that I referred to explicitly say that that relative marker is optional.
Yes, I think that's what Mizan also said in her remark to this comment. Then about numerals now, we have another question by Timur. Let me get there. Dear Bernard, you have shown that aussi, aussi is not possible, but I wonder whether you tried aussi, the 2000 nominative, as a parallel to at aussi.
Okay, I did try all possibilities. For the ones that I labeled as ungrammatical, I would occasionally get hits. But there's certainly a big difference that for the forms where you count in thousands, then you get lots of hits on the internet. The forms where you do not count in thousands, you get a few hits. Some of them might be archaic forms, non-standard forms, or some of them might simply be rarer alternatives. That's why in my presentation at one point, I did emphasize the most usual construction. I should point out, maybe as a comparison, there, that even in English, I mean, in English, I would normally, if I'm counting, I would sort of count in thousands, 1,000, 2,000, 1,200, 1,300. But under certain circumstances, for instance, counting money, large amounts of money is one frequent one. It is not unusual in English to say things like $1,200. But that's not the usual way in which you construct numerals in English. Normally it would be $1,200. And there are constraints on the possibilities. So at least in my English, while I can say $1,200, it is very odd to say $1,000. I I would even say, no, I don't think I would ever say that. I would always say $1,000. So there are different constraints. It might well be that in other languages, there are similar possibilities. So even in a language like English, where the word for thousand has no internal structure, it is still possible to come up with sequences like 1200. In particular areas like dates, so names of years, of course, that's the normal construction in English. And there the constraints are somewhat different from those that obtain in the $1,200 structure.
Thank you very much. I see just now that we have a comment by Isabelle Bril that refers again to the reciprocal.
Mm-hmm.
I guess she says, or she asks, can the reflexive marker behave not as an anaphor, but as an argument of the verb co-referent with, bound by the other argument? I can read.
Okay, I wasn't actually making any strict distinction there between anaphor and argument. I mean, I was assuming that the anaphor, the reciprocal pronoun, is an argument, that it is the direct object, the patient, the P in the terminology I would actually use if I were going into more detail. So I think in that construction in the Cesic languages, there are two noun phrases. One is in the transitive construction. It is, of course, possible to have a similar construction where it's not subject and object of a transitive verb that are involved. You could, for instance, have a verb that takes some kind of oblique argument as an object. There it would be the subject that controls the subject, that is the antecedent. However, in Cesic languages, as generally in Nakh-Daghestanian languages, there is also a so-called affective construction. So for many psychological predicates, like to know, to like, to see, and so on, the experiencer stands in the dative and the stimulus stands in the absolutive. There again, in some, at least in some of the Cesic languages, one finds both canonical and non-canonical constructions, even though the cases involved are different. Instead of being ergative and absolutive, in those constructions, it's the dative or lative case and the absolutive case.
Thank you very much, Bernard. We have now we don't have any more questions, just people saying thank you. For instance, Daniel Wilson, Isabelle Bril, and also Peter Arkadiev, and also Timur, as I said, and says thank you, Bernard, Tom Durand, everyone thanks you very warmly. So I guess no, I don't see any more questions. So I'm going to, if you would like to add anything, you are very.
Okay, I would like to thank all of my audience, especially, but of course not only, those who asked questions. So thank you not only for your attention, but also for your interest.
Yes, and there were many more people who remained silent, but probably either had also questions or learned a lot from your presentation. Thank you very much for being so easy to understand despite the complexity of those languages. So many thanks to you, many thanks to all the people who watched us and interacted in the chat today. And let's meet again next Thursday, also at 8 p.m. Professor Bruna Franchetto from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro will present the rich indigenous cultures of Brazil with a focus on the verbal musical arts of the Cuicuro, a people of Southern Amazonia. See you next Thursday then, I hope, and thank you again.